written down a manuscript around the 11th century, but probably orally going much further back. The foundation myth of the Gaelic people, or the indigenous Irish people, is told in a book called Untitled, normally called the Book of Invasions, but a book of possessions would probably be a better translation. Now, the book, the Leabhar Gabhála, like so many things to do with Gaelic culture, was appropriated in the late 19th century and through the 20th century by a kind of God-ridden nationalism that was in love with heroic sacrifice and things like this. But this particular poem, thankfully, escaped that sort of attention. It's a poem that I think speaks on a universal level, and in fact it has been compared to parts of the, I'll pronounce it badly, but the Bhagavad Gita, and you'll see why I think it's a kind of statement of universality that I think could be used today as a manifesto for an ecological view of the world, because the poem, which the myth tells us that Amergin, who was the leader of the people, the invading people who came from Galicia in northern Spain, that as he stepped ashore, they say he put his right foot on the land and recited this poem. Now, it has been of interest to me for a long time, because when I came to live where I do in the southwest of Ireland, I discovered that this was the place where Amergin had stepped ashore, literally on the coastline below my house. And my house is right on the coast. In fact, my back garden has been constantly being eroded into the sea, and there'll be nothing there for my grandchild. But so that's my interest in the poem. I'll read you the translation. I begin it with am wind on sea, because in the medieval Irish it starts gaithim where town trehan, and people in this part of the world and further east may see a serendipitous connection with the holy word. So in my translation I tried to keep that, and you'll hear that in claiming the land for his people, Amergin doesn't say this belongs to us, but he identifies with it. He says that he, on behalf of his people, identifies with the flora, the fauna, and towards the end of the poem, the cosmic aspects of the sea. Am wind on sea, am waves swelling, am ocean's voice, am stag of seven clashes, am falcon on cliff, am sunlit dewdrop, am rarest of herbs, am boar enraged, am salmon in pool, am lake in plain, am fortified hilltop, am learning's essence, am sharpened spear dealing death, am God who kindles fire in the head, who makes smooth the stony mountain, who elucidates the lives of the moon, who proclaims where the sun will rest, who leads the stars like cattle from the ocean, on whom do those stars smile? What troop, what god edges blades in a plague-struck fortress, keening of weapons, keening of wind? The poem I'm going to read in the original Irish is called Fragre Scéine Avergin, which means Scéine's reply to Avergin. Now, Scéine was the wife of Amergin, the leader who chanted the piece I just read in translation, and mythologically speaking, because all this is myth, there's no historical basis for what I'm saying, but mythologically speaking, they say she is buried under a stone alignment near where I live. In fact, that alignment is on the winter setting sun, and I was there one very beautiful winter sunset, clear frosty evening, and there was a perfect sunset. It's usually, we go there almost every year to see will the alignment happen again this year. Of course it does, but you have to take it for granted, because 9 times out of 10 you won't be able to see it for mist and rain. But I saw it this particularly beautiful evening, and I imagined Shkena replying to Amergin, and I took the structure of Amergin's poem and embodied it into what I hope is a more feminine, softened version of his poem. I'm going to read it in 2 parts, and so I'll come to the original Irish. I will read the English first, then the Irish bit, then English, then Irish. Shkena's reply to Amergin. If you are the wind on the sea, I am the water tingling under your breeze. If you are a wave in flood, I am an empty shell dreaming of your coming. If you are the roar of a storm, I am the tide lapping in the noon heat. If you are the stag of 7 combats, I will pick my way gracefully through furs. If you are a hawk on the cliff, I will bless you with lyrics of lark song. If you are a dewdrop in the sun, I will bruise the morning grass with you. If you are the fairest of flowers, I will blossom year upon year with you. If you are a maddened boar, I will charm your tusks into laughter. If you are a salmon in the pool, I will lure infinities of insects to you. If you are a lake in the plain, I will plumb your very depths. If you are the essence of poetry, I am all of your muses. If you are edging towards a fight, I will bewitch you to bluntness. If you are kindling inspiration in the mind, I will blow on the seed of the fire for you. Mas tusa gwae na mara, sme an ariga para féin fuid leohine. Mas town dealan hu is slagán follow me a tnú le tacht. Currid gas a roir na fiachla fadagut. Mas bradán hu sa lin, meawlhad kalyoga in a geert a chut. Mas loch vahu, riad gatoin pwil on it. Mas tú rún na heigshe, mission na na meihagut, ma bhíon fair art chun trodda, curad kangel na cianúlach da art. Ma bhíon tinifa aint sa chiaun agut, shaded shiel na tinidit. I know in my heart who made the way smooth for me, was a star of knowledge for me, gave the sun and moon to me. And though the stones close in and light moves towards its end, we will shadow one another, word for word with the wind. Thos ag ma chríistig cé réitig an bailachtam, cé ba réalt ólis, cé bhran grian agus gealachram. Is in anion na gloch seo, agus an solas bheith dul an éag, marhead ská scáliat, focal ocal leis an ngé. No, just beg rhymer. I'm going to move from mythology right up to just over a year ago. in Washington, Donald Trump was inaugurated president. And I've written a poem called During Donald Trump's Inauguration. Now, the rest of the poem doesn't mention Donald Trump, because it's very hard to write about him. He does his own satire far better than I could. But I had been trying to write a poem for quite some years before that, since I first heard a story about Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was somebody whose singing I had loved for years and years. An American black actor, singer, started off his career as a professional football player. I think the first black player to play in the Football League, then became an actor, then a singer. But he became very much persona non grata because he was a communist, although I think he was never a member of the party. But he supported left-wing causes all around the world, and particularly during the McCarthy years in the early 1950s, fell very much foul of that movement, and in fact his career never really recovered, and he died a lot of depression. But one of the things that struck my mind is that his passport was taken from him, and he had arranged to go to a miners, to address a miners' union convention in Canada, but he was stopped from doing so by the State Department. So what was done, I think the year was 1952, is that they brought a truck, a flatbed truck, up to the border, and with whatever fairly primitive amplification system there was, he sang the concert across the border. And in fact, that exercise was repeated, I think, 4 or 5 times in the years following. And that always, I wanted to write about it, but I didn't know how to write about it. And it suddenly came to me during Trump's inauguration, particularly when he was talking about borders and protecting borders and building walls, and the fact that what Trump does is support wealth. I think racism and things like that are really just weapons for him. His real interest is corporate wealth. So that gave me the poem I wanted to write. Paul Robeson was also a huge man, physically enormous. He was literally a towering figure, and of course when you think of Trump, you think of tower and all sorts of things like that. And now this thing is gone blank, so okay, I have it again. During Donald Trump's inauguration, I closed my eyes to conjure from the 1950s an image of that towering man, Paul Robeson, singing his heart and soul across the border between Washington State and Canada, when tides of race and power and wealth surged all as one to try to drown him out, snatching his passport lest his songs be heard by the mine, mill and smelter workers' union. I conjured the noisy flatback truck maneuvered to the border, and the straining loudspeakers bearing the burden of his songs to where his masters feared to grant him passage. And I conjured all those gathered thousands rising to Joe Hill, to Old Man River, and to Let My People Go, rising to anthems that might crack dividing walls. And this still I hoard, that profound voice rolling across the barriers built by poisoned money, urgent with the wish to make America good. And Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Liam.
Thanks very much, Paddy. Hello, everybody. I just want to say, first of all, this is my first visit to India, and I have to say we've been treated with such kindness and sweetness and humanity and decency. It has really moved all of us, and this is a wonderful festival. And just the culture that you have here, it's wonderful walking around Calicut and you see Muslims, Hindus, Catholics living together. I think this place is an example to the world, and I'm really moved by everybody here. I'm going to read from this book. It's called Call Mother Lonely Field. I'll explain the title to you first briefly. The title is also the title of a song written by a friend of mine who died a couple of years ago, called Jackie Lever, a Scottish singer. And he wrote this beautiful song which has a line in it: like young Irish men in English bars, the song of home betrays us. But it's a song about his mother, and I asked him one time where did the title come from, and he explained it to me that he was walking by the River Thames just outside London in the middle of the winter one time, and it was a sunny day, it was cold, and he was walking across a field, and the field was frozen solid, and there was frost on the mud, and it was gleaming in the sun. And he said his mother at the time was ill. She was very old, and he said it reminded of her that she was this kind of beautiful but very frosted thing. So to a certain extent, this is what this book is about as well. It's also about my father. I was born in 1962 in Belfast. My mother and father grew up in West Belfast. Belfast is a very industrial city in the north of Ireland. Lots of political divisions. My parents were involved in the Irish language movement in Belfast. My father was a postman. He was also an activist in the Esperanto movement. He believed in the idea of an international language that wasn't English. No, that wasn't to be, but that was one of the things he did. The book is also about dreams. Anyway, that's enough. I'll just read from the book now, and it goes like this. Put my glasses on. I was wondering why I couldn't read there. My father would often tell me his dark dreams. In them, I'm always a little boy, and we are lost in a forest. It is night, and we cannot see where we are going. I fall into quicksand. I am trapped. I am sinking. My dad frantically tries to rescue me. He stretches his hand to me, but cannot reach me. After his death, my own dark dreams came. I see myself sitting on the Black Mountain, gazing down on the city. Immediately behind the Black Mountain rises the summit of Divis Mountain, whose name comes from the Irish dovish, or black place. I look out to Belfast Lough, and there is a massive swell building near Helen's Bay. A huge wave rises. A wall of sea rising like a dragon from the depths, a tsunami that will drown the whole city of Belfast. And although I am on the mountain, I can also see into the kitchen in Moorland, as if it is only a couple of feet away. My ma and da are sitting down to tea, oblivious to the catastrophe hurtling towards them. I run down the hillside, but I know it is too late. I know I cannot save them. I find my dream echoed in an old scale she or fairy tale from Donegal called Na Tree Honey, the Three Waves. It tells of a man and a son out fishing on the open sea. It is a quiet, calm day. Then three large waves rise behind them as they head for land. The first is big, the second larger, and the third is so massive they fear they are about to be drowned. The father asks his son to cast a knife in Santua, into the tua, a word that is difficult to translate. In Dineen's Irish dictionary, it is defined as evoking the sinister, wrongness, goete, or negative magic. The son does his father's bidding, hurling the knife into the heart of the demonic wave. Within the blink of an eye, the wave vanishes, and the men come safely to land. That night, the son is visited by a man who tells him the knife is embedded in his daughter's forehead, and that he must accompany him to remove the knife. He is taken to a fairy island and warned to refuse anything he is offered. He is brought to where the girl is stretched on a bed. He removes the knife. She arises, safe and sound. The island people offer him all manner of things, but he refuses their gifts. The man tells the son he must forsake his native land, and so he does, heading for America, never to see his father again. For my father, Liam McCarrine, Irish was a place of refuge. He's once interviewed for BBC Radio's programme, Charman, where guests were asked what gave them sanctuary in their lives. He chose the Irish language itself. He hid within and took comfort from words. My father recalled that the older folk thought a child born after the death of its father had healing powers. My grandfather was said to have such powers. He had cures for whooping cough, thrush, and other throat infections. In his youth, he practiced his healing when asked, even though he didn't actually believe it himself, to cure thrush. He would blow 3 times into the affected child's mouth, invoking the Trinity. For whooping cough, a lock of his hair would be tied to the shirt of the sick person. He would comment, my father said, that he would sometimes be left nearly bald. It would never go out without his cap. There were even superstitions and magic beliefs that lasted into my father's time. He wrote of the Belfast lamplighter, who would emerge at twilight to illuminate the city. He carried a long pole from which dangled a lit wick encased in a mesh. The girls stood beneath the gas lamps with their dresses stretched out before them, believing they would be filled with gold. But as soon as they looked down, the gold vanished like a will of the wisp. Now, the next section is about trams in Belfast. Before we had buses, we had electric trams. They were beautiful machines. My father loved them. They were phased out, and my father had dreams of trams. My father was young when his father died suddenly. He had called on my dad to get up for work one morning. When my dad came back at the end of the day, his father was dead. He was so distraught that he hadn't had a chance to say goodbye or to receive his father's farewell blessing. In later years, he began to dream about his father. For over 20 years, he had the same dream nearly every night. He is standing at the corner of Clonard Street and the Falls Road, waiting for a bus. Instead of a bus, there arrives a tram. He lights up with delight when he sees it. Just as he is about to board, the tram picks up speed and disappears into a mist. No matter how many times he had the dream, he never managed to board the tram. Why he should have this dream so often puzzled my father. For the life of him, he couldn't figure it out. Finally, he decided to visit a doctor friend who knew a bit about psychology. He told him of his childhood tram journeys. The tram and your father are inextricably linked. That tram is an image or symbol of your father. You can't get on that tram, and you never will, no matter how many times you have the dream. My mother went to work in a linen mill, cloth mill in Belfast during this, just around about the time before the Second World War. She actually worked in a bomb factory during the Second World War, but before that in a linen factory. And she went, this is about her. During the 1970s, my mother went to night classes in St. Joseph's studying English. Her first essay was My First Day at Work, and I still have it. It is written in her gorgeous copper plate script and has some punctuation, a rare thing for the ma. Her writing was usually a breathless torrent, no full stops, no commas, no pause in the urgency. She opens by telling the reader that her mother died when she was only 7 years old. when her sister Annie was only 2.5. After her mother's death, she is taken care of by an aunt. Then, when she reaches 14, her aunt takes ill. My mother leaves school to look after the house. Shortly after the aunt dies, and my mother has to work in Greaves's mill, she becomes a doffer, collecting bobbins that were filled with yarn from the machines, stacking them in wooden boxes, refilling the machines with empty ones. She feels cold and fearsome at the sight of the huge mill and the crowds flocking through its doors, their chattering voices breaking the stillness of the morning. Her head throbs with the incessant din of the mill. The building is full of dust. Her back aches from constant bending and lifting. She describes herself as looking like a character from Jane Eyre. Her dress consisted of short brown coat, brown shoes and ankle socks. My hair, which was long, was plaited and tied with a bow. She wonders how anybody could employ somebody with such a timid and childish figure as I must have projected to them. Her spirits lift when she's brought into a jolly crowd for lunch, but she goes home dreading that this job is her fate. My mother, I think, dreamt of escape with a terrible passion. In my father, she found a man who shared her unswerving devotion, a good man, a moral man of few vices. Together they dreamed of a world different from their past. They would give their children the Irish language, a tongue that represented something different. Irish and the home were fused together. My father could quote William Blake and would sometimes sing Jerusalem. He dreamed of an Ireland that was a green and pleasant land, like Blake's Arcadian England. Together, my ma and da set out to create a home that would be a microcosm of the kingdom they wanted to see. My father, as a postman, he used to work on a railway, unload mail from trains, a train station near the shipyards in Belfast. My brother and I used to go with him on a Saturday night to help him, and this is about that. Saturday nights, the dad took Brandon and myself to York Street Station, down by the docks. Here the trains arrived from the Larne boat, loaded with mail from England, Scotland, Wales, beyond. We'd help my father carry post bags to the Royal Mail vans. In the 1970s, York Street Station was still an old world place, a final vestige of Victorian Belfast. In the bar, aged wood panelling, stained glass windows, old men would drown pints of Guinness and scan the pages of Ireland's Saturday Night and the Belfast Telegraph. We drank Cokes and ate crisps. The dad would have a smoke and a pint. Outside the ferries lay docked along Donegal Quay, the cranes looming over the Lagan. I remember An Claphollis, the gloaming, the evening turning to nightfall in Belfast. Huge clouds of starlings would spiral around the river's bridges, sweeping down to the water's surface, swooping under their arches, hurtling up again. Above Donegal Square, pigeons flocked to the parapets of the City Hall and the department stores of Royal Avenue, a cacophony of bird screech rising above the dim roar of evening traffic. I remember one blazing Saturday afternoon in July. I am walking with my father down the few remaining streets of Belfast Sailor Town. The da is sweating. We go into York Street Station to cool down. By the ticket office there is a glass case, and inside it there is a model of an old steam train. Its side is cut open, exposing the intricate workings of the engine. My father gives me an old penny to put in the slot. The pistons jerk into action. The wheels turn, magical, hypnotic. I am entranced. My father used to sing songs to me at bedtime, and this is about one of those songs. There was an Irish revolutionary in the 18th century. In 1798, there was an attempted revolution in Ireland by a group called the United Irishmen. One of them was a Protestant man from Belfast called Henry Joy McCracken, who was a hero of my father's. The Da also sang to me. Henry Joy was my favourite. This tale of a great man who instilled men with the courage to defy an empire, to fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity, only to suffer defeat and to be murdered on the gallows. It was to Cave Hill that Henry Joy McCracken fled in the aftermath of the Battle of Antrim. He found refuge with local gamekeeper David Budell, whose limestone cottage nestled within the deep woods by Ben Madigan. Henry Joy was in love with one of the gamekeeper's daughters, Mary, whom he had secretly married. Cachalo Burns, As I Roved Out, one of my dad's favourite books, contains many wonderful descriptions of and stories about Cave Hill. The caves themselves, 5 in total, were reputedly man-made, but by whom and for what reason, nobody knows. The 3rd, 4th and 5th caves are linked by a tunnel. They were the perfect hiding place for anyone seeking a safe haven from the law. Henry Joy is a song of faith and friendship. It is also a song of loss and sorrow. It tells the story of Henry Joy and the United Irishmen from the point of view of a young follower from the glens of Antrim, stirred into action by the sound of fife and drum and the martial tramp of men. In his final verse, the narrator watches Henry Joy walking to his death, his sister Mary by his side, and it tells of their farewell kiss. In Belfast town they built a tree, and their red coats mustered there. I saw him come as the beat of a drum rolled out in the barrack square. He kissed his sister, went aloft, and waved a last goodbye. My God, he died. I turned and I cried, they have murdered Henry Joy. What defines the life and death of Henry Joy is love. One of McCracken's workmen, the English calico printer William Thompson, refused to testify against his employer, despite being given 200 lashes. Prior to his execution, McCracken asked to see his minister and friend, the Reverend Sinclair Kelburn. On arriving, he immediately burst into tears, declaring, "Oh, Harry, you did not know how much I loved you." I see Henry Joy perched on the parapet of MacArt's Fort with his telescope, watching for British warships plying the waters of Belfast Lough. When the da reaches the song's sad end, my eyes and cheeks are wet. Okay, I'll read a little bit about my mother, and then I think I'll finish up with another bit. Whenever my mother got really, my parents got really old, my mother, she was starting to get Alzheimer's. My father was having difficulty looking after her. There were nasty people living in Belfast at this time. The Troubles actually sort of gave birth to not just political violence, but people who came out of the political violence who were just thugs, criminals, and this is about something that happened. Eventually, the sanctuary of Moorland, that was my family's house, is violated. In the early hours one morning, 2 gunmen smash open the kitchen door. They drag my father out of bed and use electrical cable to tie him to a chair. "We're in the wrong house, for fuck's sake," one of them shouts, but it makes no difference. His companion holds a gun to my father's head and asks him where his money is. There is no argument, and my father tells him there's cash in the biscuit tin in the kitchen, £1,000. They take the money, cut the phone line, warn the man down not to call for help for at least 30 minutes. Immediately after that, my mother was very bad. We put her in a nursing home. My mother was never the same. Taken from moorland and from years of reassuring domestic ritual, she fell further into the oblivion of dementia. She began to speak Irish to me again when I visited. It became a secret language in which she would rail against the nursing staff and how they couldn't understand that there was nothing wrong with her. But William Gulna Walya, I want to go home. This was her endless, heartbreaking refrain. Once outside the doors of the nursing home, I would burst into floods of tears. The thing my mother wanted more than anything else in the world was the one thing I couldn't give her. Another black dream. My father returns from the dead. I'm sitting at home in Moorland, telling the ma that the da has just died. But I turn, and he is standing there. He takes his glasses off, wipes them, puts them back on. I turn back to my mother to see her fall off her armchair, the newspaper slipping from her lap. I rush over to her, hold her in my arms, and like a vampire, struck by sunlight in a 1930s horror movie, I see her age decades and seconds, her face wrinkling and collapsing. I panic. I tell her I love her. I know, Liam, you were always my wee boy. These are her last words before she is a skeleton and then dust. I'll finish with the tram journey again. My father did make one further tram journey, though. It was St. Patrick's Day, and he had the day off. I must have been 6 or so at the time. Brendan reminded the da of a long-standing promise to take us to the Transport Museum, then in Witham Street. Rachamage, said the da. We'll go. When we reached the museum, my father had no interest in the trains, fire engines and cars. His heart gladdened when he saw the trams. Up we went on an old tram that was open. The da sat down and shut his eyes, and for a little while, his childhood flooded back. He was no longer a father with his 2 sons, but a wee boy with his daddy, travelling to Greencastle. When he opened his eyes again, they were moist with tears. From that day on, he never dreamed of trams again. That's it. Cornelia Mygov, thank you very much. If anybody has questions for Paddy or myself, we're happy to answer them.
Yes, now it's time for interaction with the audience. You can ask questions, both of them.
Good morning, Bert. I just want to ask Paddy a question in the first instance. Just on the whole question of writer's inspiration, that do you regularly write? This is a writer's question. Do you regularly write? Do you seek for inspiration? Does it come for you? Do you seek it out in any particular way, or is it just something that happens?
Yes to all of the above. I'm completely inconsistent. I don't sit down with a blank page saying, what will I write today? I have to have an idea or a line. Or so I usually, in poetry, I usually work from a line. Whether that's in English or Irish, that's usually what decides the language of the poem. And then I will spend a long time letting that stew in my head, and then there's very rarely a poem will come quickly. There's usually just a lot of hard graft. What I do tend to do increasingly in recent years, which I think you can do it much more methodically, is I can always translate, because the basic inspiration is there, the subject matter is there, what you want to say is there, is already done by somebody else. So the only creative work I have to do is take this and try to transfer it, usually into English, but not always. So if my own writing isn't happening, I'll usually turn to translation. But I'm basically pretty lazy.
Yeah, I have a question for Liam. One of the problems with real life as art is that it tends to be messy, and encounters you have early in your life don't have satisfactory resolutions. The villains don't get the comeuppance. You don't, close the journey all that often. So the temptation is to move somewhat away from the truth for the sake of a good story. How much did you succumb to that temptation?
I'm tempted to say that the answer to that is, I forget who actually said it, but all the true things I'm about to tell you are lies. The way I would answer that question, I remember a debate in my family one time about my father, and we came across a photograph in a book one time. It was a history of Belfast, and there was a postman walking down High Street in Belfast, and there was a huge debate about whether that was actually my father or not in the family, and we finally resolved the debate by the fact that the strap was going across the wrong way, that my father wore the bag a different way. When I wrote the stories, well, you know yourself when you're telling a story in a pub, you know that it gets embellished and it alters, and every time you never tell the same story the same way twice. I did show the book obviously to my brothers and my sister, and there would be little details that people would go, well, no, that didn't happen. But then, in one family you will get 5 different versions of exactly the same incident, and what is truth and what is not. I don't know sometimes. It's a dream, it's a vision, it's yeah.
Do you know whether any of your poems or your work has been translated into Malayalam? Has any of your work been translated into Malayalam?
No. The only language my book has been translated into is Ukrainian so far.
No, I'm afraid not. I'd love somebody to pirate it and do it.
But just the particular, not only the poem, but one of the things that I think poetry in Kerala is a lot about nature and meaning, and that poem I think would translate really well. And I think the story that you read people would be really interested in if they could have time to read it and see the context. So if there's any translators out there, these guys would really like their works translated.
I'd love to have them translated because, like Liam, I am absolutely astounded by the level of public involvement in this festival, and I'm particularly impressed with the amount of young people here is absolutely extraordinary. I'm shocked, amazed, and absolutely delighted with it. So I would love to be translated.
This is not a question as such, just that I was reminded of another artist, another creator who faced problems in America. I'm talking about Charlie Chaplin, who was sounded out and he left the United States, but eventually his body was exhumed and taken back. I was thinking, when I read that news, I was thinking that if I was in charge, I would have refused to give the body, because he was driven out of the US. They had no right to claim it back.
It's a very serendipitous person you mentioned, because Charlie Chaplin, the village where I live, which is a very small, remote village, used to come there on holidays. And there is a statue to Charlie Chaplin which causes traffic jams during the summer because everybody gets off to have their photograph taken, and unfortunately the statue is right at the middle of the side of the road, so everybody backs away. But and we have in that village, and for the last few years, an annual Charlie Chaplin film and comedy festival. So.
Hi. This is going to be something out of the context of poetry. I'm just curious. If you could describe Ireland in one word, what would it be? Could you, or something else? I mean.
One word. Contradictory.
I think Paddy nailed it on the head there.
You have written a poem about Donald Trump. What is the role of, can poetry play any role in the world of politics? What is the role of poetry in these troubled times?
Yes, I think poetry can play a role. I think it completely depends on the poet. I don't have much patience with the idea that all poets should be political or all poets should be politically involved. I think poets have a duty to be citizens in the same way as carpenters or bankers or policemen or whatever have a duty to be citizens. And to that extent, I think poetry, I don't usually write political poetry, and I have been involved in politics, in party politics, but that's a completely different thing from my poetry. But certainly poetry can be inspirational, okay? The only thing is that poetry can be weaponized as well, and I would hate to see poetry weaponized. If it stirs conscience, stirs sensibility, stirs the empathy to others, which should be the basis of good politics, that is the role I would see for it.
Yeah, I'd more or less agree with Paddy about that. I can think of I remember recently going to see Brecht, and Brecht worked in a particular period of time. I don't know if it works anymore. I'm also very wary of people who try to use music or poetry to have a message in inverted commas. I think the thing to do is to reflect your times and to tell the truth. And telling the truth sometimes means not taking an ideological stance, That's not to say that the poet cannot be a political person, but I think if you're bringing politics into poetry, you do have to be very careful. I think the poetry and the music of poetry becomes first, really.
Yes.
So let me ask us a very simple question. What is the significance of the poetry in this present age? What is the relevance of poetry in this present, especially, techno-savvy world?
Well, I suppose my answer to that for me is look around me. If you had asked me that question in Ireland, I would be inclined to be saying it's of dwindling significance, small audience and whatever. But what I have seen here, and obviously much of the poetry, I don't understand, but what I've seen here and the involvement in poetry and literature and its sort of fruitful mix with politics say that certainly here is very significant, and I will go home very much affirmed as a practicing a practitioner of poetry by what I've experienced here.
Hello. When James Joyce's Ulysses was selected as the best book of fiction in the millennium, what did you feel about that? When James Joyce's Ulysses was selected as the best fictional work of the millennium, what did you feel about it?
Well, I feel pleased that it's a work of Irish literature. I think it's a work of great genius. I think it's a book that, to me, is a book to be dipped into in bits rather than read through. I personally feel more at home with Joyce's stories in Dubliners than I would with Ulysses. I think it's a little bit too much in love with its way of writing, and Finnegan's Wake, I give up very early on. But I think what Ulysses did, even in the title of it, I think that, and it's giving the epic significance to the ordinary. I think that is a hugely valuable sort of thing, so that we can see the ordinary in the epic and the epic in the ordinary.